You'll be able to unmute and put your questions directly to speakers, but you're also welcome to use the chat throughout the event. And after we close, to those of you here in person, you're invited to join us for some light refreshments after the event. And we've got the room till about 8 o'clock. So we've got a lot to squeeze in. So I'm going to need all the speakers to stick to their allocated timings, please. These three here in particular. And with that, over to Becky.
Thanks very much, Polly. And you can see I'm keen to get talking to you about Insecure Lives today. It's been a really fascinating project, and we've got a lot to talk about. Tonight is a special night because it's the first night we've had a chance to talk about all our findings. But in fact, it's only going to be the first of several events and publications that we'll be producing later on in the spring and into the summer. So lots to look forward to. But let me get started. So you see lots of logos here. Oh, little technical problem straight away.
The down arrow.
Oh, it's the down arrow.
Maybe. No.
No. Oh, well.
Could be the down arrow.
Thank you.
Do that one.
Thanks, Polly. Okay. So the clicker.
It's the round wheel.
Okay.
That's
There we go. So sorry not to get started quicker than that. This work was funded by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government as part of an unusual relationship with the Economic and Social Research Council. And although a year or less than a year feels like a very short time in research, it's a long time in politics. So this project started out as something linked in with a levelling up agenda. And researchers are charged with trying to think of projects that could investigate how levelling up and reducing the gaps between different parts of the country could be promoted, and to look at what was making it difficult for people to participate in levelling up or to get the advantages from it. Now, of course, that terminology has faded over the last 10 months, but the issues are still there. And when we came together as a group of researchers, we were thinking about our experiences in past research projects, whether looking at data or talking to individuals. We were thinking about people who had lots of things going on in their lives, lots of negative things, lots of worrying things. And the artist who later on became involved in the work, Laura Savala, drew this image to try and encapsulate this kind of situation. Somebody who has lots of things to worry about, worrying about their income, which might go down, worrying about their housing situation, worrying about trying to meet the needs of their children and fulfill their caring responsibilities. And that sort of became the image that we then developed up into a full project. So let me introduce the idea of multiple insecurities. And as Polly said, it's an attempt to make a new approach to understanding people's difficulties and to think about the barriers to opportunities for people who want to change their own lives and contribute, of course, to national productivity and growth. So we started off with thinking about the value of security. And our basic hypothesis was that people who are secure, and importantly, who also subjectively feel secure, don't have to worry about disasters in their own lives. They don't have to worry about suffering, hardship, destitution, the really bad things happening. And therefore, we think they will be better placed to take advantage of opportunities to develop themselves, to train, to support their children, and so on. And of course, it's not just our hypothesis. So the idea of security is popular with politicians. And Rachel Reeves talked last year about securonomics and said that what she was going to try and do was to provide a platform for people to take chosen risks. And she wanted to reduce the unchosen negative downside risks so that people could then choose to launch themselves into new training or new opportunities from a secure platform. And of course, the term security came up a lot yesterday again in the spring statement. And it's not just politicians as well and researchers who think about these things. So jumping forward a bit, Clara Louise is a chosen pseudonym of one of the participants in the research. And she spoke quite movingly about the value of security, or the potential value of security in life, because she doesn't have it. And she said, I would love to be in a place where I could just feel safe and feel just content that I don't have to worry about paying the rent or buying food, and we can live a healthy lifestyle in a safe place. And she puts it so well. It sounds quite basic, but when you're living like this, then you aspire to that. So we've thought a lot amongst ourselves as a team about the concept of multiple insecurities, what security is, but also insecurity. And work done by Stuart Henderson and Helen Lomax as part of the project has developed a strong definition of insecurity and then multiple insecurities. So insecurity is similar to other familiar concepts within social analysis like precarity, vulnerability, deprivation, and so on. But of these, it's probably closest to precarity. And it's about the current situation, the factual, objective situation that people are in, like their income or their housing status. But it's different because it also includes subjective responses. So how people feel, do they feel secure in their housing, whatever the objective situation is? And it's about looking ahead. So it's about predicting whether something will happen. Will you be evicted? Will your landlord raise the rent? And it implies something about people's mental states. It's not just about what's in their bank account, it's about what's going on inside their minds, how they're reacting to the situation. And we argue that insecurity can include stable objective situations. If you're on a stable low income, you are still financially insecure because you're insecure about meeting your required expenses, your necessary expenses, and anything changing could throw you out of kilter. And we think that insecurity of these kinds is likely to limit your ability to take advantage of all kinds of opportunities, whether it's jobs, training, or supporting your children. And insecurity is not just monodimensional. It's not just about income, say. It can exist across multiple domains of life. And several domains have been quite well thought about, written about, studied, defined. For example, insecure work, insecure housing, food insecurity has an internationally recognized definition. Income insecurity is measured through poverty dynamics and other things. But we think there can also be insecurity in other domains which have been less thought about, less researched, less defined, like health, care, relationships, the nature of your environment. All of these can be sources of insecurity, but perhaps more thinking needs to be done about how you can conceptualize, define, and measure those things. So these are our methods through the research project. So it's a 10-month project, which is just coming to an end. First of all, we talked with policymakers and practitioners, and the result of that was that they felt intuitively they understood what we were thinking about when we were talking about multiple insecurities, although they mostly didn't use the term. There were numerous fascinating literature reviews carried out by Helen and Stuart, as I've mentioned, looking at individual dimensions of insecurity and how they work together. There's substantial quantitative analysis, which Abigail is going to talk about later, a fieldwork element with 36 people experiencing multiple insecurities, which Helen will talk about, and finally a further literature review looking at potential policy approaches and things that might be promising for addressing multiple insecurities. So just to look at that in another way, here are the dimensions of insecurity that we looked at and the different research methods we used to look at them. So we've tried to cover the field, but we haven't quite covered every aspect. But we see this project as a start with this new research area, and we think we've made a pretty substantial start here, covering all these dimensions. So I'm just about to hand over to Abigail. I'd just like to say that having looked at the literature and having looked at the data, we found lots of examples of organisations that had tried to talk about one dimension of insecurity and perhaps another. So, for example, Citizens Advice have looked at how people coming to them with one problem have worries in another area as well that emerge when they arrive. The Trussell Trust, which has researched all the people coming to use their food banks, has found that they have food insecurity, but many other problems. But what Abigail's been able to do has been looking at multiple dimensions simultaneously in a really systematic way.
Thank you, Becky. Now I'm only going to be able to give you a small taster of the quantitative work that we've been doing on multiple insecurities. It's going to be a long report coming out and some various other papers, so you can look at that. So I realise potentially a lot of questions about what we've been doing when we've tried to operationalise this concept, and we can pick those up at the end. So I'm going to talk about how we operationalised the concept of multiple insecurity. And measured in multiple insecurity using understanding society data as a data set we chose because it collects information from a representative sample of UK adults. We look at adults who are aged 18 and over. And it has consistent measures over a 14-year period now, so running from 2009 to 2023. We have about 500,000 observations overall, with around up to 50,000 individuals in any particular year. And we're using this to provide what we believe are the first statistics on multiple insecurity. And we estimate prevalence of insecurity both between and within single dimensions, looking at different aspects within the dimensions as well as overall. We quantify multiple insecurities, looking at different multiples, looking at whether you have 2 insecurities, 3, 4, or 5 across the different dimensions. I'm going to show you a selection. We also calculate risks or prevalence for different groups and how they vary, and an assessment of the relationship between multiple insecurity and well-being. I'm going to present some results from the statistical models that we've been estimating. Now, how do we go about defining insecurity and multiple insecurities? Well, first of all, we'd learned from the literature review that Irene and Stuart worked on about the main sort of dimensions. And we also, our work's grounded in the theory of the capability approach that helped us to guide us into thinking about what were the main dimensions of life that were important from a quality of life perspective. And we ended up, in terms of what we could operationalise, 5 main dimensions of insecurity. And these are financial, housing, work, health, and caring. There are, of course, so what we, for the multiple insecurities work, we required the variables to be consistently collected over the 14 waves. And there were inevitably compromises we had to make in terms of which variables and which aspects of insecurity we could collect. So, for example, under the caring insecurity, ideally, we would have also included care and unmet need for care. But the information on unmet need for care has only been available for a few waves towards the end of the panel. So we weren't able to use it for this, but when we look at the single dimensions, we supplement this work with more detailed work for each of those dimensions. And for example, under housing insecurity, we would have liked to have had more measures on housing quality, but we weren't able to operationalise that. And so these are the different aspects that we look at that we use to define our single dimension, multiple dimensions of insecurity. And the way that we define insecurity is that if you're insecure according to any one of these aspects, you're classified as insecure in that dimension. Of course, there are different ways of doing it, but that's the approach we took. Okay, so what does this look like when we apply this to the data for understanding society? Well, these show the trends in our 5 dimensions of insecurity. And what you can see, this prevalence varies across the different dimensions, and also the trends vary for the different dimensions. And so if we look at some of these in terms of financial, you can see there's quite a deep U-shaped trend there. And what's happening here is that we've got the legacy of the financial crisis, and then towards the end of the period of the cost of living crisis having effect on people's financial insecurities. Housing insecurity largely follows a downward trend, and that's because after the financial crisis, there were large cuts to interest rates and mortgage costs, and the proportion of people who are behind with their housing costs, spending more than 30% of their income on housing payments, fell over time. But of course, it picked up again at the end of the period as interest rates increased, inflation increased. We also find a downward trend in work insecurity. And this is because of one of our measures of low pay. The national minimum wage, upgrading of the minimum wage, national minimum wage meant that there was a fall in the number of low paid workers. Plus also there was an increase in employment activity amongst women. So overall that led to a downward. It looks like there is a sort of untrended or difficult to discern trend for health insecurities. But we do very detailed work behind these overall trends to look at all aspects and by breaking down by characteristics to see what's going on behind these overall trends. And behind that overall trend for health insecurity, we do find quite large increases in psychological distress amongst young adults, amongst the unemployed, and amongst single parents, for example. So we have all of this detail in the report. This is the kind of overall. We've had the highest shares measured for health insecurity and the lowest for caring. For caring, we're not able to capture all of the aspects that we're interested in, but we're still picking up here between sort of 17 and 20% of people who are insecure in that dimension. I can't see the clock, Polly, but so I'm going to do my best. It's really obscured by that light. Okay, so when we get on to multiple insecurities, we can look at joint insecurities. So if you're insecure according to two of those different dimensions, so along the bottom here, we've got all those different dimensions that we can look at in terms of pairs. Now, of course, as you would expect, the share of people who are experiencing insecurity in two dimensions is lower than it is for one, but there's still quite high shares of people experiencing joint insecurities. And when we look at the trends, we can see what might be behind it from the single dimension. So both work and housing insecurity trended downwards, and so unsurprisingly, the joint insecurity does too. But when you combine either work or housing, yes, that's right. Sorry, with health, it's the health, the insecurity that dominates there, and it's untrended. Joint insecurities are lowest when they're involved in caring insecurity. That's because we're picking up least prevalence amongst caring insecurities. And the highest for the caring insecurities is when it's combined with your own health. So this is your health and you're caring for somebody else. So it's a significant joint insecurity that we're picking up. And I don't want to spend too much time on this. The highest one here is financial and health, and you can see that deep U-shaped trend in that joint insecurity. We can go on to look at three dimensions, and here I put up the charts for four of them. They are less prevalent, but we're talking here still about quite high shares of people, adults, experiencing insecurities in three dimensions. So for financial, health and housing, over 10% in any 1 year, most years that we cover. Who is most at risk? Well, we did some detailed look at the different breakdowns about who's most at risk in terms of the individual aspects at the dimension level and also in terms of multiple insecurities. And well, it does vary depending on which dimension you look at, which aspect of insecurity you look at. Some groups do seem to face particularly high risks of insecurity. And overall, we find quite consistently it's women, it's younger adults, it's some ethnic minority groups, single-headed households, particularly those of working age, including lone parents, the unemployed, long-term sick and disabled, and individuals who are taking care of the family or home. There is some regional variation. There's not a huge amount of difference between regions at that level. We think there's a lot more going on beneath the regional level. We do find that London and north of England are particularly, people living in those areas particularly likely to have multiple insecurities. And individuals living in the most deprived neighbourhoods. How long have I got? Okay. I might need one more. So finally, I'm going to present some results from the statistical modelling work that we've been doing, where we've been estimating the relationship between multiple insecurity and well-being. And we looked at 4 different outcomes for wellbeing, whether you're having trouble sleeping due to worry, much more than usual, whether you're under constant strain, much more than usual, whether you're feeling lonely or isolated from other people. There are 4 main wellbeing outcomes. Now, we estimate probate regression models and include a range of other risk factors there. So the models include our insecurity indicators for each of the relevant dimensions, as well as the multiple insecurity variable. And not only do we find that statistically significant effects for the single dimensions, but we do find an additional effect if you suffer from multiple insecurities. And this is highly statistically significant. So, for example, if we had a model with financial, housing and health, if you put those in single dimensions, you put in the multiple, that you find this additional effect of suffering from the multiple insecurity. I'm not going to present lots of regression models, luckily, because I really haven't got time. But I'm going to use those results to calculate. I'm going to use them to calculate some predicted probabilities, and these are predicted probabilities of experiencing the wellbeing outcome. So this chart, for example, on the left-hand side, you can see these are these representative individuals. We have the types of multiple insecurities in the next column, and then we have sleep and strain and lonely and isolated. And then if we look at some of those results, I'm going to whiz through them a little bit. So our top group here, this is our all-age model, a woman who's aged 35 to 44, single, white, living in England, in the most deprived neighbourhoods. If she doesn't experience any of the insecurities in terms of financial, housing and work, her risk of suffering from sleep issues is around 25%. But if she's experiencing multiple insecurities in those 3 dimensions, it's double that, about 50%, these predicted probabilities from the regression models. So you can see the sort of scale of the effect. Now, I've rather cherry-picked these example representative peoples here from an insecurity perspective, so sort of worst and best case scenarios. The bottom figure here is for a man, 45 to 54, in a couple with children. He's white, he lives in Wales, in the least disadvantaged areas. If he suffers from no multiple insecurities or insecurities, a 50% chance of reporting strain. That's double if he suffers from multiple insecurities. And then if we look at the lonely and isolated outcomes, so if I start here with this working age woman, 35 to 44, she's a single parent, white, living in Wales and most deprived neighbourhoods. If she doesn't suffer from insecurities, multiple insecurities, has about a 6% chance of reporting being isolated. If she suffers from multiple insecurities, a 40% chance, really quite significant uplift there. And this man, 65 to 74, a couple, white, in England, in the least deprived neighbourhoods. Well, the predicted probability of reporting being lonely is 0, but it's around 7% if it suffers from multiple insecurities. And I'm really sorry, Polly, because I know I've gone over. I'm now going to hand over to Helen. So this is a way of trying to use those regression results with statistical models to think about individuals so that we can link with our qualitative research, which of course is about interviewing individuals and understanding what their experiences of multiple insecurities are.
Yeah. Lessons in how to use the mouse. Thank you, thanks, Polly. Thanks, Abigail. So I'm really happy to be up here talking on behalf of work package 4, which was a qualitative work package, and I worked with Laura and Sally and with our artist Laura Savannah as well. This work package was all about trying to how can we generate new qualitative information from the experience of people who from the perspective of people who are experiencing multiple insecurities. What risks and combinations of risk are people experiencing? How do these build up and combine to affect well-being, employment, training, and impacts on children in terms of their education and well-being of the children? and what resources do people bring into play their personal, familial, community resources to help mitigate some of these insecurities, and what third sector and statutory bodies they draw upon to help with these multiple insecurities. What makes things worse, preventing people from reaching their potential, achieving their aspirations and having meaningful life that they want for themselves and their families, and what helps. Right, I'm just going to try and use the mouse. Okay, great. Okay, so to do this, we developed a whole set of new methods and a methodology, which, what Abigail was talking about earlier, it was framed by a capabilities approach. So we wanted to work positively with people, insensitively, and recognising and respecting their own capabilities to positively influence their own lives and lives of people around them in context of these quite difficult challenges that the people are experiencing, in order to understand what challenges them to flourish. And also, how are they flourishing potentially in spite of these multiple insecurities? And we did find some evidence of that, which I'll talk about in a moment. So we developed these image elicitation methods, working with artist Laura Savala. So she drew for us these concepts, these multiple insecurities about where you live, people you care for, who care for you, legal and benefit advice, work, your home, relationships, health, money, in order to help people to talk about things that might be quite difficult to talk about, that are sensitive. So these different little prompts represent different insecurities. And what we did was we worked with trusted stakeholders to access people who are experiencing 2 or more insecurities. And from previous research, we had relationships with 4 different areas. We wanted to, so we were selected purposefully. We wanted to work with areas of high levels of deprivation, different aspects of insecurity. So for example, we worked in East Lindsey, in Mablethorpe, a spatially segregated neighbourhood in the east of England. We worked in the south of England, in Milton Keynes, in an area of multiple deprivation, but in a high growth, high job city. And in Sheffield, we worked in an area called Burngreave in North Sheffield, which has is multiply insecure by our definition, and has high levels of disadvantage and deprivation in terms of outcomes for children and health and life expectancy. Okay. This is a little bit of, I mean, all of us could talk forever. We've got so much data and we've got so much to say about our sample, for instance, but this is to give you a sense, it's just a bit of a sense of the sorts of people we spoke to. So we conducted focus groups and we conducted one-to-one interviews using our visual prompts. So these visual prompts were printed out, and Sally's got them, I can show them to you. And they enable people to sort of physically hold and organise and look at and arrange them so they can think how to make them more salient. You know, to ask questions about what's most relevant for you now. When did these things start? How does it feel? What's most important? How do they interact together for you? What is the impact for you in terms of your life, your well-being, and what about your children? How do these things impact on your... So it enabled us to ask really quite sensitive conversations, and I think it was quite a sensitive manner. And just to say that we felt we did it because it's a new method that we developed. We asked people, how did it feel to do this? And people, I mean, people in general, I would say, had a very positive experience talking about some of this stuff with us. So Yuzana, these are all pseudonyms. Yuzana talked about, made it easy to discuss things that are sometimes a bit abstract. And then this lovely quotation from CB, from Maplethorpe. He laid out the cards and he put them in order about his difficulties he was facing, and his aspirations for how he'd overcome these difficulties around employment, home life. So in Mablethorpe, it's quite expensive to live on your own. He lives with his parents, he's 36, he'd like to live on his own, he'd like a nice relationship. He has mental and physical health problems, and he just wants to get to that jackpot, to the bullseye. And he used the cards to show us this journey that he envisaged for himself. sorry, I actually used the arrow then, which obviously is out of bounds. So in terms of the impact of multiple insecurities on our 36 participants. So on average, people selected 4 multiple insecurities that were impacting their lives now. But they discussed over 5, so over 5.5. So if we just counted the cars that people selected, that would have sort of over 4, and then they talked a lot in depth about these, actually over 5.5 per person. And just in terms of thinking about a little bit of quantitative information, sort of referring back to what Abigail was talking about. So, you know, finance, so the big most significant thing for people was health. 29 people out of 36 chose health and security, and then financial, housing and caring. And to follow what Abigail was saying about trends, so the biggie was sort of financial and health. They combine for people, for 18 out of 36 people. But remember, they had other insecurities as well as those 2. And then 3 insecurities that combined together were for 10 people out of 36 was financial, health and housing, but again, with other things too. So now I just wanted to, but also, so I wanted, one of the things about the qualitative, I feel I'm talking really quickly. I hope I'm not being too quick. So I've only got 10 minutes. So we want to really get at the felt experience. What's it like? How's it impact on, and again, relating back to what Abigail was talking about, well-being. So really interested in exploring the impact on well-being. And it is huge. So just people talked about boiling over. You saw this, the visual at the start with Glenda talking about of being on high alert 24/7, and that really was conveyed to us about it's just stress. I'm constantly stressed. I never get a break. I'm always chasing something or somebody or something to try and sort things out to make life better and bearable. Okay, so insecurities combine and compound each other. So we saw this, for example, in I'll show you in a moment a visual from Adam and Snow White, the White family, just about how everything impacts everything else. So he works nights. They sleep with the two kids in the same room. Everything is a struggle, and everything impacts everything else. It affects you in your job. It affects even our kids for learning. It affects them. Adam and Snow White can't afford to give their children all the extras, you know, the trips, the meaningful experiences that they know their children are missing out on. So they're aware of, they live in a flat on the 3rd floor. They can't afford to move. They have no garden. There's health conditions in the family. She's not allowed to hang the washing up outside on the balcony. So she has to hang it up, and that makes asthma worse in the children. So everything affects everything else, and we get that, a real sense of how these things really impact people's quality of life and their well-being and their health. And then they're trapped. So Christina says, nobody's going to do a house swap with me because my house is in such a state. I wouldn't give it to anybody else anyway. So she's, you know, it's completely trapped. How am I doing it? In a minute. Okay, so I'm just going to show you some of the visuals. So this is sort of borne out in some of, so we've tried to capture, so everybody that we worked with, we created a written pen portrait to try and understand how the insecurities impact each other. But we also created 4 visuals to use, which we hope convey just how everything works together. So here we've got Clara Louise, who you know, talks about how her insecurities are interconnected. Her health prevents her from working, which limits her income and her choice of housing and where she lives. The physical environment and housing affect her well-being. They affect her children's well-being. She talks about going away from the area and letting her children take their shoes off and run in the grass. They can't run in the grass where she lives because of glass and dogma and all the rest of it, and where she lives now. So her children don't have access to the things that they need to grow and develop and, you know, have a good childhood. She's overcrowded. She can't afford fresh fruit and vegetables. We heard that a lot. So we did do a little bit of food insecurity, where people, they live in food deserts. They can't get fresh fruit and vegetables. And after the first week of benefits, but after that first week, you're not able to buy fruit for your child who may be a fruit bat, to cite one of our participants. Okay. And this is Adam and Snow White showing them in overcrowded house. he works nights, he has health conditions. He's been told that it's been made worse by his really long hours of work at night. And I've talked a little bit about, and they chose all, you can see the little cars there, all the insecurities affect their situation. I'm just going to, just very quickly, what makes it worse? Stigmatising and dehumanising systems, lack of joined up systems and support. So about not being believed, you're lower class, you're lower, you're lying, you have to prove, you have to prove, you have to prove. And then just about having to constantly tell your story all the time, not being believed. So your child is born with a disability, it's never going to get better, but you're asked all the time about your child will get better and having to tell that story again and again. But all, okay, I will just promise before this last one. So what helps? Can't believe we did all this work on this presentation that we're only getting to talk about a tiny bit of it. But so what helps? So we found a lot of people have lots of aspirations. All our participants had aspirations for themselves. I mean, some of this was talk about, you know, you saw from Adam and Clara Louise, just surviving actually, just trying to survive and live a basic life. But they did as children, they look back and as young people, they wanted to be a midwife or a maths teacher. They would like to they have lots to offer. So we found one of the things that helped people a lot was having apart from, so there's a few things, right? Secure, regular, flexible employment. Doesn't always have to be flexible, but flexible will be good for lots of people who have health conditions. Training they can't afford to access, secure housing, safe, functioning neighbourhoods. But also, in the context of these difficulties, these multiple insecurities, what helps is hyper-local support services. So we did a lot of work in each of the area, talking to stakeholders, talking to people about these safe spaces and where they are supported and helped. So not just being signposted to services, but where people go in because they need help with a form to fill in, say, because they don't understand the form, and then go and end up helping as a volunteer, so working in the community pantry, giving things back. And I don't really have time, but I just want to give a tiny bit about, I'll let Snow White finishes off. So Snow White says, I know it's only one place, but it was actually made a massive difference in my life. So now I've got the qualifications to start to work, and maybe that will increase our income, and also my kids have a good start in their journey to learn and education, which gives me time to look after myself and to study and to have qualifications. I mean, just one kind of support comes from one place, and it's made a massive difference to my life. Done. Sorry. So I hope that's given you a little bit of a flavour of the qualitative, and I'm sorry I did rush through it rather.
Thanks very much, Helen. I'm just going to say a few words now to summarise our findings and to prepare for the discussion that's to come. So, just a few points here. So I think we're very pleased because we think we've managed to define and measure multiple insecurities, and that's something that hasn't happened up till now. And I think Helen has demonstrated how visual aids help in eliciting discussion and also in conveying some sense of the impact of multiple insecurities. And we don't want to claim too much. We don't think that we can now replace and do away with poverty or multiple disadvantage or other important terms. But we think multiple insecurities does add something. It's complementary, supplementary, and particularly the question of the mental processes and the mental impact of multiple insecurities. We think is something new, helpful, and interesting. To summarise the empirical work, large minorities of people in the UK are affected by individual insecurities. So there's a big numbers, bigger say than affected by poverty, the number of people affected by worrying about money one way or another or being under financial pressure. And smaller but still significant minorities are affected by multiple insecurities, as Abigail showed us. And we do have some evidence showing that if you've got one insecurity, you are more likely to have another. If you look at that just in the raw data, that's what earlier data from the Trussell Trust and others have shown, that we've got this in a more comprehensive level. And if we're thinking about trends over time, Abigail's shown us that there's a U-shaped trend, but we are now at the stage where the level of multiple insecurities is as high as it was just after the global financial crisis, And I think, you know, the global financial crisis is capitalized and it was responded to with a gigantic worldwide $1 trillion policy effort. We're not in quite the same situation here, but we do have at least a national multiple insecurity crisis. So the pressure that people are under and probably the mental health responses and problems that people are facing are as bad as they were at the time when the policy response was in the trillions. That's not happening now. I think there's a big question there about what kind of policy response we should need, but given the level of pressure and the mental health problems associated with that, Abigail has shown, we can talk certainly about the scale of policy response that might be appropriate. So just to say a little bit more to follow up what Abigail was saying, we know that certain groups of people are more affected. And one thing that really stood out from the patterns that they've seen for some of the other sorts of measures in this area are that lone adults are particularly under pressure with individual insecurities and multiple insecurities. And of course, they can't pool their costs in the way that larger households can. We've shown that multiple insecurities are associated with wellbeing problems even after controls, and the more insecurities you have, the more wellbeing problems you're likely to have. And Abigail's illustrated how people in quite diverse situations can experience multiple insecurities and have impacts on their mental health. The quality of work shows that these insecurities, for example, housing insecurity can be driven by a lot more detailed issues than we were able to capture in the quantitative work. So aspects of housing quality, for example, or waiting for housing repairs could also create a sense of housing insecurity. But the quality of work was able to demonstrate how there are knock-on issues, knock-on problems for schooling, for getting into work. People are a long way away from work, and going back to our original levelling up agenda and thinking about the current continuing agenda about growth, there are real problems here. So this is a policy problem for people who are concerned about well-being and suffering, but also if you're concerned about raising employment levels and developing growth. So I think there's also a question, just to ask you, we're in no position to answer it here, but because of the associations that we've seen between mental health outcomes and multiple insecurities, is there any way that the growth of insecurity that we've seen in some dimensions since the mid-2010s could play a role in explaining increases in mental health problems, particularly amongst certain groups within the population? Question for you, really, and for further research. In terms of policy, I've talked about the scale I think might be appropriate to address these problems. The evidence that we found about connections between insecurities suggests that if you are an organisation providing services and you find that one of your clients has an insecurity, it's more likely than average they will have another. And addressing one insecurity is likely to reduce the risk of others. We think that addressing financial insecurity is a priority because the literature shows and the qualitative evidence shows that it's at the root of some causal chains of insecurities, obviously. And we think that preventing increases in insecurity is important, as well as trying to reduce insecurity. We think that growth, if it's achieved, and even if it's inclusive, will not necessarily reduce insecurity. For example, you may be on a good income, but is that income secure? You may still have the mental health associations with insecure income, even if you're not in poverty. And that's something that thought about inclusivity and growth should address. And looking at the trends over time, it seems that some insecurity may be linked to the economic cycle. Some is policy generated when it comes to the level of benefits, for example, or the processes to get hold of benefits. And just a couple more points. Just like it has been claimed many times that work is not a sure route out of poverty, work is not a sure route to security. So on average, people in work have lower rates of individual and multiple insecurities than people not in work. But lots of workers do experience insecurities, and insecurities increase amongst workers. over time, and certainly the information from all case study participants was that work could be accompanied by a lot of worry. Now, proposed benefit changes will already be having effects just from people hearing about them in the media. They will already be creating, mental impacts, and they will add to insecurity by the measures that we've used in our quantitative work. And they will probably be adding to some of those associations in mental health terms, people being under strain and feeling sleepless already before they actually happened. And I think another interesting thing to draw out from the results is that there were high rates of financial pessimism amongst people who were otherwise secure at the moment. And these kind of worries about the future amongst financially secure people, people in secure employment and secure housing, are important, should be paid attention to, and may have political consequences as well. Thank you very much for being such patient listeners. You've heard enough from the research team. It's now time to pass over to our panel.